The August night was too hot for Nebraska, the kind of heat that made the stars look like they were sweating. Daniel Matthews sat on the rusted fire escape of the old Clearwater Observatory, legs dangling over the edge, watching his sneakers trace patterns against nothing. 12 years old and already an expert at being somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. The observatory had been abandoned for 3 years, ever since Dr. Reeves died, and nobody wanted to buy a building that looked like a concrete mushroom. Daniel came here because it was quiet, because his mom's boyfriend was loud, and because sometimes you needed a place where the universe felt bigger than your problems. That's when he heard the crying. Not the normal kind of crying, not the sound of a kid who'd skinned their knee or lost at Mario Kart. This was the sound of someone trying very hard not to make any sound at all, which made it somehow louder. Daniel froze, one hand on the railing, his brain rapidly calculating the probability that he'd stumbled onto either a ghost situation or a serial killer situation, neither of which he was prepared for. The crying was coming from behind the observatory, near where the satellite dishes used to be before someone stole them for scrap. Daniel crept along the building's curve, his heart doing a drum solo against his ribs. He peered around the corner and saw her. She was maybe his age, maybe a little younger, sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest. She wore clothes that looked expensive in a way he couldn't quite define. The fabric caught the moonlight strangely, like it couldn't decide whether it was silver or blue. Her hair was dark, falling past her shoulders, and she was definitely, absolutely crying, her whole body shaking with it. "Hey," Daniel said, because he was 12 and didn't know any better opening lines. "Are you okay?" She jerked her head up so fast he thought she might have hurt her neck. Her eyes were huge and dark, reflecting too much light, and her face was streaked with tears that looked oddly luminescent. But it was her ears that made Daniel's brain stutter like a scratched CD. They were long. Not like stretched-out earlobes or anything, they swept back from her head in these graceful points, like something from the fantasy games his friend Marcus played. Like an elf, if elves were real and also apparently had really bad nights. "You can see me?" she said, and her voice had an accent he couldn't place. Not Spanish, not French, not anything Ms. Peterson played in language lab. Yeah. Daniel said, wondering if this was some kind of trick question. "You're sitting right there." She stared at him for a long moment, then wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I thought perhaps the device was working. Making me invisible to your kind." "Your kind?" Daniel repeated, and then his eyes went back to those ears, and his brain made a connection that seemed absolutely insane but also explained everything. "Oh. Oh no. Are you a runaway from some kind of experimental surgery program? Did your parents do something weird to you?" She blinked at him. "Surgery? For your ears? Because they're, He gestured vaguely at his own normal, round ears. "Different?" To his surprise, she laughed, or at least made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "No surgery. These are supposed to be here." She touched one of the elongated ears self-consciously. "Where I'm from, they're completely normal. Boring, even. My friend Keela has ears that curl at the tips, which is much more interesting." Daniel sat down on the ground, his legs suddenly feeling unreliable. "Where you're from?" "Yes." "Which is?" She pointed up. Not at any building or direction that made sense. Just up, at the sky, at the stars that were sweating in the heat. "Oh," Daniel said. Then, because he was 12 and had seen every Star Wars movie at least 4 times, "that is so cool." She looked at him like he'd just said something in a language she didn't expect him to speak. "Cool? Yeah. I mean, assuming you're not messing with me, which you could be, but those ears look pretty real, and I don't think makeup is that good. Are you actually an alien? Like, from space? Real space?" "I am from space, yes. Real space." Her mouth twitched, almost smiling. "As opposed to fake space. You know what I mean." Daniel leaned forward, his fear evaporating into curiosity. What are you doing here? Is your spaceship broken? Are you here to study us? Please tell me you're not here to vaporize the planet. No vaporizing, she said, and this time she did smile, just a little. I'm waiting for my family. We were supposed to meet here, but something went wrong with the timing. They'll come back for me. They have to. Her voice cracked on the last word, and the fear underneath it was so familiar that Daniel forgot for a moment about the years, about space, about everything except the fact that this was just a kid who was scared and alone. How long have you been waiting? 2 of your days. 2 days. Have you eaten anything? She shook her head. I have some supplies, but I'm saving them. In case it takes longer. Daniel stood up, brushing dirt off his jeans. Okay, new plan. You wait here, and I mean actually here, don't go invisible or beam up or whatever, and I'll be back in 20 minutes. Where are you going? To get sandwiches, Daniel said. Because first rule of space travel should probably be don't let people starve. Even if they're aliens. Especially if they're aliens. He ran home, raided the kitchen with the stealth of someone who'd perfected sneaking snacks during his mom's shift work, and made it back to the observatory with 2 peanut butter sandwiches, a bag of chips, and 3 juice boxes. She was still there, looking relieved and surprised in equal measure. They sat together in the shadow of the observatory, and she ate like someone who'd forgotten food could taste good. Daniel tried not to stare at her ears and failed completely. Does it hurt? He asked. Being away from your family? Yes, she said simply. Does it hurt being away from yours? Daniel thought about his dad, who'd left when he was 7. His mom, who worked double shifts and came home too tired to ask about his day. The boyfriend who filled. Daniel Matthews stared at the error code blinking on his monitor and wondered, not for the first time that week, if he was losing his mind. The satellite array at North Star Communications had been his baby for 3 years now, reliable as gravity, and suddenly it was speaking in what could only be described as patterns. Not random interference. Patterns. Hey, Danny boy, you figure out why Satellite 7 keeps doing the cha-cha? Rick leaned over the cubicle wall, coffee in hand, his tie decorated with tiny rockets that Daniel had always found more depressing than whimsical. Working on it, Daniel said, minimizing the window where he'd been trying to translate the signal bursts into something, anything, that made sense. Morse code, binary, even musical notes. Nothing fit, but his brain insisted there was structure there, the way you could feel someone staring at you in a crowded room. Well, work faster. The boss is getting twitchy, and when he gets twitchy, I get twitchy, and when I get twitchy, I eat all the good snacks from the vending machine before you get there. That's just cruel, Rick. Survival of the fittest, buddy. Rick disappeared back into his cube, and Daniel returned to the signal data, pulling up 2 weeks of logs. There, in the noise, those same intervals. Almost like a heartbeat, if heartbeats could be digital and came from 22,000 miles above the earth. His phone buzzed. Rebecca. Again. 3rd time today, which meant she wanted to talk about the wedding invitations, or the seating chart, or which flowers were less likely to make his Aunt Carol sneeze. Daniel loved Rebecca in the comfortable way you loved a favorite sweater, warm, reliable, no surprises. She worked in accounting, made excellent lasagna, and had never once suggested doing anything that couldn't be found in a Midwestern lifestyle magazine. Hey, babe, he answered, still watching the data scroll past. Daniel, you sound distracted. Are you looking at satellite things again? It's literally my job to look at satellite things. You know what I mean. That obsessive look you get. Mrs. Patterson asked if we decided on the centerpieces, and I need you to care about this for like 5 consecutive minutes. Daniel dragged his attention away from the screen. Centerpieces. Yes. The things in the center. Daniel. I vote for whatever makes you happy. There was a sigh on the other end that contained multitudes of disappointed hopes. Fine. But tonight we're going through the RSVP list, and you're going to be present, mentally and physically. Your body's been here but your brain's been in orbit lately. She hung up before he could formulate a response that wouldn't prove her point. Daniel looked back at the patterns on his screen, and something in his chest tightened with a feeling he couldn't name. Like nostalgia for something that hadn't happened yet, or maybe had happened a long time ago and he'd forgotten to remember it. That night, he dreamed of stars that hummed. The next morning brought a registered letter to his apartment. Daniel signed for it while still in his bathrobe, coffee cooling on the counter, Rebecca already gone to her early meeting. The return address was just a P.O. box in Virginia, the kind of anonymous government location that showed up in movies right before things got weird. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a thumb drive. The letter was brief. Mr. Matthews, your expertise is requested for consultation regarding Project Echo. Please review the attached materials. Discretion is appreciated. Transportation will be arranged. Well, that's not ominous at all, Daniel said to his empty apartment. He looked at the thumb drive like it might contain either top-secret alien autopsies or really elaborate spam. Probably spam. Definitely spam. He plugged it into his laptop anyway, because curiosity had always been his favorite of the deadly sins. The files were heavily redacted, black bars everywhere like a classified Mad Lib, but what he could read made his coffee go cold in his stomach. Satellite anomalies. Signal patterns. Dates going back 15 years, all noted and logged and marked with priority flags that got progressively more urgent. And there, buried in a folder labeled Historical Reference, was a scan of something that made Daniel's hands go numb. It was a journal page. His journal page. From when he was 12, the summer his handwriting was an illegible sprawl and he'd written everything in mechanical pencil. He recognized the star doodles in the margins, the way he'd pressed too hard and torn the paper slightly. Night 3, the entry read. She says they're coming back for her tonight. Made her promise we'd meet again when we're older. Sounds like something from a movie but she was serious. Gave her grandpa's compass so she'd remember. She touched my hand and it felt like static electricity but warm. The sky started making that sound again, the one that's not quite sound, more like the air is vibrating. I think I'm going to miss her. Is that stupid? I've known her for 3 days. Daniel remembered writing that. He also remembered forgetting it, the way childhood memories faded into that fuzzy space between real and imagined. The girl with the pointed ears who'd cried behind the old observatory. He'd convinced himself over the years that she'd been a runaway, or a dream, or a story his 12-year-old brain had constructed from loneliness and too much science fiction. But someone had his journal. Someone had been paying attention. His phone rang, unknown number, and Daniel answered it before his brain caught up with his hand. Mr. Matthews, I trust you received our package. The voice was male, professional, with an accent that suggested expensive education and zero patience for nonsense. You broke into my childhood home and stole my diary. We prefer the term, secured relevant historical documents. Your mother was quite helpful, actually. Lovely woman. She mentioned you're getting married soon. Congratulations. This is insane. This is actually insane. The ship appeared on a Tuesday, because apparently even first contact had to deal with the middle of the work week. Daniel was in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and poor decisions when every phone in the building started buzzing simultaneously. Then the emergency broadcast system kicked in, which he'd only ever heard during tornado warnings, and a voice suggested in the carefully calm tone of someone having a quiet breakdown that everyone should remain where they were and await further instructions. Is this a drill? Rebecca asked. She'd driven up to have lunch with him, probably to ambush him with more wedding logistics, and now they were both staring at Rick's phone as he pulled up the news feed. That is not a drill, Rick said, turning the screen so they could all see. The ship hung above Denver like someone had parked a small city in the sky and forgotten where they'd left it. It wasn't saucer-shaped or menacing or anything Hollywood had prepared them for. It looked organic somehow, all smooth curves and surfaces that caught light in ways that made Daniel's eyes hurt if he looked too long. Beautiful and wrong at the same time, like a violin made of ice. "Oh my God," Rebecca said. "Oh my God, Daniel, there's a spaceship. There's an actual spaceship. I can see that, babe. What do we do? Should we go to the basement? Do we have a protocol for this?" "Our protocol is satellite maintenance," Rick said. "I don't think we covered alien invasion in the employee handbook." Daniel couldn't stop staring at the ship. Something about it felt familiar, the same way the signal patterns had felt familiar, the same way his dreams had been feeling familiar for weeks now. Like a song he'd heard once and couldn't quite remember the words to. His phone rang. That same unknown number from before. "Mr. Matthews, I hope you're watching the news," the voice said. "Kind of hard to miss." "Good. A car is outside your building. You have approximately 4 minutes to get in it before things become complicated." "Complicated how?" "The kind of complicated that involves explaining to your fiancé why you're being collected by government officials while there's a spacecraft hovering over Colorado. I suspect that conversation won't go well." Daniel looked at Rebecca, who was gripping his arm hard enough to leave marks. "I have to go," he said. "What?" "No. Daniel, there's a spaceship, we need to stick together, we need to. They want me specifically. I think it has to do with the satellite work." It wasn't quite a lie, just not quite the truth either. "I'll call you as soon as I can, I promise." He kissed her forehead and left before she could argue, before he could think too hard about what he was doing, before the logical part of his brain that sounded a lot like Rebecca could point out that getting in mysterious government cars during an alien arrival was probably not best practice. The car was black and nondescript and driven by someone who looked like they'd been grown in a lab specifically for not answering questions. They drove in silence while Daniel watched the sky through the tinted windows, waiting for laser beams or tractor beams or any of the beams that science fiction had taught him to expect. Instead, the ship just hung there, waiting. They took him to a facility that his GPS claimed didn't exist, through security checkpoints that got progressively more serious, until he was in a room with about 30 other people who all had the same expression of confused terror he suspected was on his own face. Some were in military uniforms, others in suits, a few in clothes that suggested they'd been pulled from normal Tuesday activities just like him. A woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of posture that suggested she'd been ordering people around since birth stood at the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming on short notice. I'm Director Sarah Voss, and approximately 40 minutes ago, we received a transmission from the vessel currently positioned over Denver. They've requested a meeting. More specifically, they've requested meetings with specific individuals. Your names were on that list." Someone near the back raised their hand like they were in grade school. "Why us?" "We're still determining that. Some of you have relevant scientific expertise. Others have military or diplomatic experience. And some of you," her eyes found Daniel in the crowd, "we honestly have no idea why you're here, but they asked for you by name." Daniel's stomach dropped somewhere around his knees. "They know my name. They know all of your names. Correct spelling, current addresses, in one case someone's recently changed legal name after a divorce. They've done their homework." The room erupted in overlapping questions and panic, which Director Voss shut down with a hand gesture that could have stopped traffic. "The meeting is in 3 hours at a neutral location we're establishing now. You can refuse to attend, but I'm told that would be considered diplomatically unfortunate. Questions that aren't variations of 'what the hell is happening' will be taken now." Daniel raised his hand, feeling absurd. "Do we know what they want? They claim to want an alliance. They claim to mean no harm. They claim to have been observing us for some time with our best interests at heart." Voss's expression suggested she believed none of this. "They also claim that several of you have already met their people, though they've declined to provide specifics until the face-to-face meeting." "Already met their people?" Daniel thought of a girl with pointed ears crying behind an observatory, of a compass he'd given away 15 years ago, of promises made under stars that seemed very far away and suddenly far too close. "Director," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "when you say their people look like us, how specifically like us are we talking?" "Remarkably similar, according to preliminary analysis of the transmission." "Why?" "Just wondering if we need to worry about the ears." Several people looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Director Voss's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "Mr. Matthews, is there something you'd like to share with the group?" Daniel thought about his journal, about government agents who knew more about his childhood than he did, about how nothing in his life had felt quite right since those signal patterns started. "I think I might know why I'm on the list," he said. The neutral location turned out to be a hastily cleared warehouse in the middle of nowhere, which Daniel supposed made sense if you were trying to avoid public panic but also felt deeply anticlimactic. First contact with alien civilization, and they'd gone with industrial chic. "This is where humanity makes history," Rick muttered beside him. Daniel had been surprised when Rick's name appeared on the list too, until Rick mentioned he'd spent a summer in high school working at the Clearwater Observatory, back when it was still operational. Apparently the aliens had very thorough records. "At least the lighting's dramatic," Daniel said, watching technicians position cameras and recording equipment around a hastily assembled conference table. Someone had even brought flowers, which seemed optimistic. "I'm going to throw up," Rick said. "Please don't. I think that would be diplomatically unfortunate." They'd been briefed 3 times in the past 2 hours, each briefing more useless than the last. "Be polite. Don't promise anything. Remember you're representing Earth." As if Daniel had any idea how to represent an entire planet when he could barely represent himself at homeowner association meetings. Director Voss appeared at his elbow, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who probably dreamed in tactical formations. "Mr. Matthews, I need you to understand something. Whatever connection you think you have with these people, it doesn't make you special. It makes you useful. Possibly to them, definitely to us. Don't forget which planet you're standing on. Hard to forget with gravity reminding me every second. I'm serious. They asked for you specifically. That means something, and until we know what, you're an asset. Act like one." She moved away before Daniel could ask what exactly an asset was supposed to act like. Probably not terrified and confused, which ruled out his current approach. The aliens arrived exactly on time, which Daniel found both reassuring and unsettling. 6 of them, walking through the warehouse doors like they were entering a perfectly normal meeting and not the most significant moment in human history. They wore clothes that looked almost human, fitted suits in deep blues and grays that caught the light strangely, and they moved with a grace that made Daniel think of dancers or soldiers or both. 5 of them had those distinctive ears, sweeping back in elegant points. The 6th had ears that did indeed curl at the tips, which made Daniel think of a friend named Keela and a girl who'd been crying behind an observatory. Then she walked in, and Daniel forgot how to breathe properly. She'd grown up. Obviously she'd grown up, 15 years had passed, but somehow Daniel's brain hadn't prepared for the reality of it. She was taller than he remembered, moving with a confidence that made the warehouse feel too small. Her dark hair was longer, pulled back in a style that was both practical and elegant. The years he remembered were the same, but everything else had changed, sharpened, become something that made him understand why Director Voss had used the word asset with such careful precision. She saw him immediately, her eyes finding his in the crowd of human delegates, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, relief, something else he couldn't name. "Thank you for meeting with us," she said, and her voice still had that accent, still carried that slight unfamiliarity that made English sound like a second language she'd mastered but not inherited. "I am Lyra of the 3rd Fleet, speaking for the Coalition in matters of first contact and diplomatic exchange. These are my advisors and colleagues." One of the human diplomats, a man whose name tag read Ambassador Peters, stepped forward with the kind of forced calm that probably cost him years of therapy. "We welcome you to Earth. Though we're curious why this meeting required such specific attendees. Because trust must be built on foundation, Lyra said, and her eyes went back to Daniel. And some of us have foundations already here. Rick leaned over and whispered, Danny, why is the alien queen looking at you like that? I'll explain later. You absolutely will not, but I appreciate the lie. Lyra continued, addressing the room but somehow still talking to Daniel. 15 of your years ago, my people began preliminary observation of Earth. We were careful, quiet, trying to understand you before making ourselves known. Sometimes our scouts made direct contact. Brief encounters, usually with children, who we thought would be less likely to report us or be believed if they did. Her mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile. We underestimated how thoroughly your governments investigate everything. We try, Director Voss said dryly. One of those scouts was me. I was young, foolish, and got separated from my team during an equipment malfunction. I was stranded for 3 of your days, certain I would die on a strange world, until a boy found me. She looked directly at Daniel now, no hiding it. He brought me food. Talked to me about stars. Made me feel less alone in the universe. When my team finally retrieved me, he gave me something to remember him by. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a compass, old and brass and definitely, impossibly, his grandfather's compass. The one he'd given away to a crying girl 15 years ago and convinced himself he'd lost. The room went very quiet. Oh, you have got to be kidding me, Rick whispered. Ambassador Peters cleared his throat. Ms. Lyra, are you suggesting that this meeting, this entire first contact scenario, is based on a childhood encounter? I am suggesting that trust between civilizations must start somewhere, Lyra said. And I knew that I could trust at least one human. That seemed like a reasonable place to begin. Daniel raised his hand, feeling ridiculous, feeling like he was 12 again and asking stupid questions. Can I say something? Please, Lyra said, and there was something in her voice, nervousness, hope, he couldn't tell. This is insane. You built an interstellar alliance on the fact that I made you peanut butter sandwiches. Lyra's expression suggested she was trying not to laugh, which made the whole situation even more surreal. It wasn't just the sandwiches, though they were surprisingly good. It was the fact that you helped someone who was different without asking for anything in return. That's rarer than you might think, across any civilization. The next 3 weeks dissolved into a chaos of diplomacy, media frenzy, and Daniel's life becoming something he no longer recognized. Rebecca left him, which hurt less than he expected and more than he wanted to admit. She'd taken one look at the news coverage, at photos of him standing next to an alien diplomat who kept his grandfather's compass like a talisman, and said, I don't know who you are anymore. The sad part was, Daniel didn't know either. He'd been assigned as a civilian liaison, which seemed to be government speak for, we don't know what to do with you but the aliens keep asking where you are. He spent his days in meetings that felt like fever dreams, translating between human bureaucracy and whatever system Lyra's people used, which seemed to involve a lot more collective decision-making and a lot less arguing about parking validation. Your species debates everything, Lyra said one evening, after a particularly exhausting session about trade agreements. They were in one of the temporary housing units set up for the alien delegation, which looked like a hotel room designed by someone who'd never actually met a human. Do you always need 12 committees to decide on lunch? That was actually pretty efficient for us, Daniel said. He was sitting on a chair that was slightly the wrong height, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been made by someone who'd heard about coffee but never tried it. You should see us during election years. She sat across from him, and in the soft light she looked more like the girl he remembered and less like the diplomatic force who'd spent the afternoon calmly dismantling the ambassador's arguments about resource allocation. I need to tell you something, she said. About why I really came back. Daniel set down his terrible coffee. I figured there was more to it than childhood nostalgia. My people are recovering from something your scientists would call an extinction-level event. We survived, but barely. We need allies, resources, connections with other worlds. When the council was choosing who would make first contact with Earth, I volunteered. I told them I had a connection here, someone who could be trusted to at least listen. The promise. Yes. But Daniel, you need to understand what that means in my culture. Promises made to children are sacred. They're considered binding in ways your legal contracts aren't. When you agreed that we'd meet again when we were grown, you created a bond that my people recognize as legitimate. Daniel processed this, his brain trying to catch up with implications that felt increasingly heavy. So when you invoked that promise to establish trust, you were using our childhood connection as some kind of diplomatic credential. Yes. She met his eyes, unflinching. And also no. I could have chosen any number of contacts. We've observed thousands of your people over the years. But I chose you because I remembered those 3 nights, and I wondered if that boy who shared his food and his stars had grown into someone who might still see me as a person first and an alien second. That's a lot to put on some sandwiches, Lyra. I know. And I'm sorry for dragging you into something so complicated. But I'm not sorry for coming back. The attack happened 2 days later, during a public ceremony meant to symbolize growing cooperation between their peoples. Daniel was standing on a stage he had no business being on, next to diplomats and leaders and Lyra, when the shots came from somewhere in the crowd. Human extremists, they'd later learn, people who thought any alliance was surrender. Security moved instantly, but Lyra moved faster. She grabbed Daniel and 2 human delegates, her species' superior reflexes evident in the speed she got them behind cover. Something exploded, a device, not large enough to kill everyone but large enough to scatter the crowd into screaming chaos. Daniel's ears were ringing, his mind trying to process the transition from boring speeches to active danger. Stay down, Lyra said, her hand on his shoulder, and he could feel her shaking slightly. Not from fear, he realized, but from adrenaline, from the same fight-or-flight response that was making his own heart try to escape his chest. They huddled there, human and alien together, while security forces from both species moved through the chaos with professional efficiency. Daniel looked at Lyra, at the fear in her eyes that she was trying to hide, and remembered a girl crying behind an observatory because she was alone and scared. Some things, apparently, didn't change no matter how many years passed or how many diplomatic credentials you earned. I'm sorry, she said quietly, while the world was loud around them. I thought bringing you into this would be safe. I thought the promise would protect us both. Promises can't stop bullets, Daniel said. But they can give you a reason to duck. She laughed, slightly hysterical. That's terrible philosophy. Yeah, well, I'm new at this whole symbolic bridge between worlds thing. The attackers were caught, the situation contained, and somehow nobody died, though several people would have interesting hospital stories. The news coverage shifted overnight from cautious optimism about alien contact to debates about security and extremism and whether first contact should involve quite so many public ceremonies. Daniel spent that night in a safe house with Lyra and her team, everyone too wired to sleep, too aware that they'd come very close to something catastrophic. She sat next to him on an uncomfortable couch, still holding his grandfather's compass, turning it over in her hands. In my culture, she said quietly, there's a concept that doesn't translate well. The closest word in your language would be partnership, but it means more than that. It's a chosen bond between people who decide to face the universe together. It's not about romance or marriage in the way you understand it. It's about commitment, alliance, chosen family. Sounds complicated. Everything worth doing is complicated. She looked at him, her dark eyes tired but clear. I came back because I made a promise to a boy under strange stars. But I'm asking now if the man he became wants to keep that promise in a deeper way. Help me build this bridge between our worlds. Not because you have to, but because you choose to. Daniel thought about Rebecca, about the comfortable life he'd planned that felt like it belonged to someone else now. He thought about satellite signals and childhood